Good afternoon. I'm Jill Christensen with the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. We have a dynamic 1-hour conversation coming to you right now. We're so glad you're here right now. We know others will be joining us as we move through this time. This is a coffee chat on reproductive justice, the global and local impacts in a post-Dobbs world. Well, we have to assume you all know about Dobbs. We are thrilled to be able to bring you this discussion, again, with key important panelists who really will enlighten the conversation from a global and that local perspective. With that, let me let you know that this comes to you from, in fact, a tripartite effort of the United Nations Association Committees, the International Law Committee, Advocacy Committee, and Human Rights Committee. We'll be here for an hour, and we're greatly appreciative of 3 panelists and a moderator who will be able to get us going. So a little bit about the UN Association of the National Capital Area, just in case this is a first-time opportunity for you. We represent members in the DMV area, Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Northern Virginia. The majority of our members are women. The majority of our members are young adults and youths. It's of no surprise that this issue is of great interest. I will also say that as an association, a nonprofit organization, which is a part of the United Nations Association of the United States, we are nonpartisan. We know that today's discussion will uplift and bring up new discussions and information about what is happening. Abortion stories are not always public. They, in fact, sometimes are shrouded in silence, sometimes in shame, sometimes in fear. Abortions happen legally and illegally all over this globe. Abortions happen not only because of unwanted pregnancies, but often, in fact, because of risk of life to the mother, situations of sexual abuse and violence also. I was quite moved several years ago, actually, this is pandemic time, just before the pandemic, at a global gathering of women and social movements, to hear from, in fact, one of the lead women from Ireland who led the process to then legalize abortion in Ireland. Her key point was what moved the needle in Ireland of a deep Catholic state that had always been opposed to abortion, but illegal abortions were happening, to then one, which is a state where abortions are legal, is that it was women in their 70s who started telling their life stories, ones that had been silenced forever. It's up to each of us how we do this. What we know is that reproductive rights is absolutely intersectional, and where you are at that intersection, by race, by class, by economic status, by language, disability, LGBT issues, all of that matters. In fact, too, of course, reproductive rights and abortion rights are men's issues. And so it is great that we have men included today, and knowing that their voices are critical in making sure that we keep things safe. As a young woman in 1980, I was in the House of Commons, a part of a demonstration that was very loud during the debate on abortion rights. That day, I was ready to be deported from England. In fact, it was simply that I had to sign a statement that I would never return to the Houses of Parliament again. Well, when I did return, more than a decade later, I was welcomed by the MPs with open arms. But in fact, abortion rights, for me at that point, a young lesbian feminist, they weren't the top of my priority, but now over these years, I certainly understand that abortion rights impact all of us. So that's what today is about. As a parent, as a daughter, all of this fits. We all have family members who are impacted. Abortion rights and reproductive justice are about bodily autonomy, economic futures and well-being, life directions, and human rights. So hold on one moment. I'm going to introduce you to this very, very exciting panel that we have and our moderator. We welcome Nabeeha Kazi Hutchins. She is the CEO and president of PAI. As PAI frames it, if a woman who is in charge of her sexual and reproductive health can change her life and transform her community, she works with policymakers in Washington, D.C. and a network of global partners to advance sexual and reproductive rights for women, girls, and other vulnerable groups. Nabeeha was born in Pakistan, raised in Mexico, and has worked for over 20 years in fact, reproductive rights in development programs. She is a quadruple degree holder with 2 undergraduate degrees and then 2 master's degrees, those from Columbia University in International Affairs and Public Health. We're very happy to have our own from UNA-NCA, Renee Dopplick, who serves as co-chair of our International Law Committee and is on our board. She's an international attorney with Inside Justice and has done great work with global nonprofits in the corporate sector and government sectors in areas of public policy, technology, and the law. Panelist Elizabeth Nash is the Principal Policy Associate with Guttmacher Institute's Public Policy Office in Washington, D.C. With Elizabeth, she's bringing in, honing in on specifically our DMV, the regional level. Guttmacher Institute is the leading research and public policy organization committed to advancing sexual and reproductive rights, SRHR, if you hear it in the discussion, worldwide. And Elizabeth brings over 20 years of experience with state policy development and analysis on reproductive rights and all kinds of layers around that. And lastly, our moderator is Catey Vera. Catey is co-chair of, in fact, the UNA-NCA Human Rights Committee. She's a lead researcher at UC Berkeley's School of Law Human Rights Center. She's deputy editor of the Review of Human Rights at Berkeley, and she is also a student at Berkeley. So you see, we've got a span of ages here ready to focus on this human rights issue, reproductive rights. So please, Catey, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jill, for those excellent words and beautiful introduction of all. I want to start with just giving you all a little bit of a run of show for how we're going to be approaching this coffee chat. I really want to focus on you all, the audience members, to be able to get your questions answered. So essentially what we will be doing is I will ask roughly 5 pre-planned questions to our panelists. We will hear their answers, and then we will move to audience questions. I'll give some more details about the specifics of that as we approach it. But let's begin. I will first want to ask a question addressed to all 3 of our panel attendees, a sort of setting the scene question, if you will. Could you please each elaborate on the environment and scope of your work prior to the Dobbs decision, and crucially, how that has changed since the decision has come out? Let's start with Elizabeth.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So before Dobbs, we were really preparing for this case. The case was accepted in December, and initially you thought, okay, this might be about Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban, but hello, the Mississippi Attorney General decided to turn it into essentially a referendum on Roe itself. And so, we were pushing out our research as fast as we can. If you're not familiar with Guttmacher, we have basically both a research and a policy side. And our researchers had been working very hard to understand more about abortion access in the years of 2019 and 2020. And so we're trying to get that research out and trying to get a set standard for the lay of the land policy-wise in, across the 50 states. And so then when the decision came down, we were somewhat prepared in the sense we had fact sheets and we had talking points and we knew what to do. Emotionally, it was incredibly hard because, the whole institute had been supporting abortion rights since 1968. And it has been pretty difficult to watch how we've seen abortion clinics close, see the bans go into effect, and know the impact on patients across the country.
Wow, absolutely. Let's also hear from Nabeeha next.
Thank you, Katie, and it's great to be here. You know, I think pre-Dobbs, PAI was watching really very closely in terms of what was going to be happening in the court, the threats. I mean, certainly we knew the makeup of the court. Our work as an organization, as a civil society organization, is to advocate to the US government and on the global stage and make sure that, you know, the policies, the investments around advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights, which includes the essential health care, which is access to safe abortion, is protected, advanced, supported. And we also work with almost 120 community-based organizations in 35 countries around the world. So we're looking at Dobbs, knowing that our space and our sector is constantly under threat. There's always a lot of opposition, but because of what was evolving with the court and the profile and the makeup of the court, we were absolutely very concerned about how this was going to influence and impact decisions abroad, and also how aligned we were going to be as a nation, right? Because the headline is that this happened in the United States. And it's not that it was a decision by the Supreme Court, it happened in the United States, and using that as an example, because the US does serve as a powerful example to the rest of the world. And we've been working to make sure that we were clarifying what was going on, that we're lifting up the evidence and the science that demonstrates why access to safe abortion is so critical for progress for women, progress for communities around the world, achieving gender equality, achieving economic empowerment, and so on and so forth. And then the other piece is supporting and amplifying the work and the voice of domestic partners and domestic leaders who are seeking and working so hard on the front line to advance abortion access. And we've continued to do that. But it is, you know, to Elizabeth's point, shocking and disconcerting that after 50 years, we are here, and on the global stage, we talk about gender equality and human rights. And that is our conversation on the global stage under this administration, yet we can't guarantee those same protections to our own people in our own country.
Right, absolutely. And lastly, but certainly not least, Renee.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As I thought about this, from my perspective, it's really on the international stage. Reproductive health has been a contentious issue for the 10 years that I've been involved at the UN, and the landscape is becoming more complex post-Dobbs. Pre-Dobbs, I think back to the negotiations of the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly the outcome document of the annual UN Commission on the Status of Women in 2014. And that outcome document was to inform and shape the SDGs and the global agenda through 2030. And in the final hours, the two contentious issues were funding, which is always a perennial, and reproductive health. And so ultimately, the countries reached consensus, including reproductive health and its multiple intersections with poverty, with violence, inclusion in society, employment, and many other areas. Nevertheless, it remained contentious at the UN, and at CSW in 2017, the countries held an unusually long and hard negotiating session. It was over 100 hours, and it did result in a consensus document. UN Women described it as remarkable that they were able to hold ground on reproductive rights and make some gains. They described it, UN Women, as remarkable, even though that year the word abortion was not included as it had been in prior years. 5 years later, where we are now, with Dobbs overturning Roe versus Wade, I see the decision being impactful on my work and more generally, in that other countries now view the United States as reversing on individual legal rights domestically, specifically a constitutional right that's been there for half a century and is delivering an inconsistent message to the world because now US domestic practice and law now differ from what is its international policy and differs from our normative global gains on gender equality and women's empowerment. So overall, the impact of my work has been broader than reproductive rights for women and men. It's really looking at what are human rights and how do we realize those rights and how do we realize justice, which is what we're talking about today. So back to you, Katie.
Thank you, Renee. That's actually an excellent transition into our next question. As you may have noted, the theme of this talk is not only reproductive justice from a localized domestic lens, but also how it impacts international norms. So I want to begin with the international global perspective. Let's start by talking about the global implications, specifically for Nabeeha and Renee. What are the global implications of overturning Roe versus Wade? I'm thinking specifically about how, if you could elaborate, on how the Dobbs ruling comes into contention, if you will, with established international goals and norms, notably SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm thinking especially of 3, which is good health and well-being, and 5 on gender equality, as well as normative treaties such as CEDAW and the ICESCR. So let's start with Nabeeha, please. Thank you.
A big question, but a very important one. And quite frankly, I've been having a lot of conversations over the past 3-4 weeks with so many of our partners abroad. And as I mentioned, we're monitoring it really, really carefully. I think how it affects and what the implications abroad are. Certainly the credibility of the United States on the global stage and these commitments, as I mentioned, to outcomes and investments that are grounded in making people's lives better, grounded in human rights and grounded in gender equality and equity and so on and so forth. I think also issues around how confident can countries and can organizations abroad feel in US commitments, in US funding, in US intentions abroad. And the other piece that we are seeing is this decision validating the opposition. I think all of these matters really come into effect, and we're seeing it loud and clear. We have heard and already seen from partners renewed energy by the opposition, using the decision that the great democracy that is the United States as an example, rolling back these rights for their own community. So questioning, should other countries be taking these issues forward, these priorities forward to ensure not only access to safe abortion, but also conversations around access to contraceptives, scaling up and expanding comprehensive sexuality education for youth. So this becomes a much bigger question, and we are, everything from efforts in East African countries where the opposition is very well funded and consistent, coming together to say, okay, let's use this moment and use the US as an excuse to renew and re-engage and add fuel to our fight and combat policies and efforts to advance access. Those are certainly a threat, but we're also seeing that this notion of, and you all may have heard this, is the concept of when the US sneezes, the world gets a cold. I think we have to question that, quite frankly. We may not be infecting the rest of the world with a cold because we are seeing emboldened movements across Latin America, Argentina, Mexico, where I'm at right now, Colombia, Chile, others, and even as of a few weeks ago, groups of advocates in Latin America came together to say, maybe we should be the example. We're the example to follow. All that to say, I think that certainly there is an impact, whether direct or not, but the world continues to watch. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that, as Elizabeth's team does so well, is amplifying the science, amplifying the evidence, making sure that we as PAI are arming our civil society partners with that information, with the tools and resources so they can not only fight the opposition, but also advance these policies and programs, and lifting up what are the examples to follow.
Great, thank you, Nabeeha, for that word of hope there. Let's see, Renee.
It is a really good question. Could Dobbs potentially trigger a new direction for international policy and norms? And Nabeeha, you were just covering how is it that the US will have leadership? Will it that inspire activism in a different direction? So from an international law perspective, I thought through, yes, it could. It could provide a new direction. The US prides itself on being a leading champion of human rights, including its leading role in the drafting and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And the Dobbs decision revoking a constitutional right of the individual is reverberating around the world within that context. And among the world leaders expressing concern, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights describes how the United States is moving away from the global progress that's been made on sexual and reproductive rights made during the past 25 years. And the reverberation, as Nabeeha was just talking about, is also invigorating activism and interest in strengthening our international safeguards as consistent with international law, particularly international human rights law and global policy goals agreed to by all the countries of the world, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, known as the SDGs. And there's a wide range of treaties and global policies that cover reproductive rights. And for the purposes of time, I'm just going to spotlight a few quick highlights related to the treaties and the SDGs. So specifically, there are at least 8 international human rights treaties that cover the right to health. And the United States has ratified and is legally bound by 3 of those 8 treaties. Those treaties address civil and political rights, eliminating racial discrimination, and the prohibition against torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. There's 2 other treaties that are widely regarded as enshrining the right to sexual and reproductive health. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ICESCR that Catey had mentioned at the beginning there. Article 12 has the right to health in it. There is also the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is known as CEDAW. Most of the attendees, you probably have heard CEDAW. It's also commonly known as the International Bill of Rights for Women. And its Article 16 guarantees women the right to have access to information, sexual education, and the right to decide on the number and spacing of children. The United States has signed but hasn't ratified those 2 treaties, which means that it can't take actions that would defeat the purpose of the treaties. But the United States is not legally bound by those treaties because we haven't become a party to the treaties. And CEDAW is nearly universal. The United States is only one of a handful of countries, and I can count them on my hand, who is not a party to that treaty. So we related to Dobbs in an amicus brief to the US Supreme Court. The special rapporteurs who advise the UN Human Rights Council assert that in overturning Roe, the United States will be acting contrary to international law by failing to recognize access to abortion as necessary for women's autonomy, equality, and non-discrimination. And they cite the international human rights treaties, the US legal obligation, and the guidance provided by the treaty bodies to assist countries with the implementation. There are other legal critics out there who argue that the right to access an abortion does not exist under international human rights law because the treaties do not explicitly include the word abortion, and that the guidance from treaty bodies is merely non-binding guidance. So it is that tension that we're in right now. So we look to the policy space, and advocates are looking to the SDGs and the groundbreaking 1994 Cairo document and its program of action, which was the first ever recognition of the reproductive rights as embracing certain human rights. And then we get the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action, which reinforced reproductive rights as a broader concept of physical, mental, and social well-being. And then quickly, as we look at the SDGs, 30-second overview of 17 global goals. As Katie was saying, SDG 3 is good health and well-being. It has reproductive healthcare services under its target 3.7. We have education, because we know that education, girls and adolescents need to complete their schooling. We have SDG 5 on gender equality, and take a look at indicators 5.6 and 5.62. And they reflect the extent to which prevailing laws enable or disable women and men's full and equal access to health and rights. And 5.6 is on whether, irrespective of the country's legal framework, whether women are able to decide their sexual and reproductive health. And SDG 16, which is the lawyer's goal, ending violence. So that's a quick view of the treaties and a few of the SDGs, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Renee. I want to ask a follow-up question. We've talked about treaties, international norms, and global institutions, but next I want to talk about individual countries. How will the fall of Roe impact these other countries, specifically as it relates to abortion access, but not only abortion access, contraceptive rights, marriage rights, and more around the world? I feel if you would like to touch on, the progress that we have seen and has been touched on just now with Ireland, as Jill mentioned, but also Argentina and Colombia, as Nabeeha mentioned. But at the same time, seeing these striking global setbacks in a number of countries, most notably with Poland and El Salvador. So how, at the individual country level, is the United States' recent overturning of Roe going to shape policy and other forms of government? Let's start with Renee this time.
Oh, this is a really good question because it's a dynamic landscape. We have seen several years of progressive loosening of the laws, decriminalizing in jurisdictions. Latin America began this trend, country upon country, small steps and some making large steps. We saw, as you said, in Ireland, we see a huge gain where they overturned a constitutional ban. Argentina, similarly, you have folks taken to the legislative floor and saying, we need to do this. We need to legalize it and we need to make it safe. We see Chile easing the ban and taking that step forward. Colombia this year. Colombia stepped forward and became the latest country to say, we want to partially decriminalize abortion. And yet we also see setbacks. We've seen Poland, and it's having among the most restrictive laws in Europe. We also see that the majority of countries around the world have where they criminalize or impose heavy financial fines for having an abortion. The American Bar Association's position is that we should not criminalize abortion. So there's a lot of room to further reform laws at the domestic level. And it's not just abortion. As Katie was just saying, it's around the bundle of rights. It's around all of the rights that allow for full inclusion in society, your political, your economic, your social, which is how we're looking at reproductive justice. You have your reproductive rights, and then you have how can you realize those? Do you have laws that allow for autonomy and decisions to be made? If rights are like the ones that we're looking at right now, what is the right? Does that right then include you can choose when to marry, who to marry? Can you divorce? Can you inherit? Can you have property? All of those other bundles of rights, the framework for how we look at the legislative or the constitutional interpretation or the framework under international law, it starts to go to all of those other rights. That's why this decision is really important. It really places into context that this is about rights for everyone.
Thank you, Renee. And now to turn to Nabeeha.
So I think to my point before is that it both complicates and it also re-energizes international movements, not just for or against access to safe abortion, but also overall access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality, and so on and so forth. What we are hearing and seeing at a country level is, in some cases, great example, the Dominican Republic, where abortion is criminalized in all cases. And there's been a long, hard battle that is still underway to pass the 3 exceptions, right? When there's harm or danger to the pregnant person's life, when there are issues of viability, and in the case of rape or incest. And there was some progress, hoping that that would hit Congress this year and make it on the docket. And it looks like it's not going to happen. Very much feeling re-energized because of the decision here in the US, and opposition saying, this is not the time, we're not going to take this on, we've got other things. However, the opportunity from the advocates and activists in the Dominican Republic is, okay, very well, you don't want to even consider or have a conversation about the exceptions that, of course, if passed, would open the door for other progress. And these are open doors that open in other countries as well. When exceptions have been passed, then you kind of keep pushing that open and improving access for others. But in the DR, they're at least saying, okay, we're maybe going to use this as an excuse then to call our leadership to task and say, if you're not going to offer access to safe abortion, then you have to allow us to implement comprehensive sexuality education in schools, which is also banned, right? So this is the duality of complexity of this decision and the influence that it is yielding to even stop a conversation, and then also re-energizing other spaces. I think this also, the impact at a country level, and certainly, again, from the perspective of civil society, of community advocates, who I always say are the truth seekers and the truth speakers, and they're holding government accountable, they're holding donors accountable, they're holding each other accountable, but there is this resurgence of, why should other countries have such a powerful influence on what we do for our own people, what we do for our own communities? In Malawi, one of our partners said that the Abortion Rights Access Network is calling out to their government saying, that is happening in the United States, and we know that the United States has an oversized influence in terms of the resources it invests abroad. We are the biggest investor and donor for reproductive health services and family planning commodities and support. So this partner in Malawi, and it resonates with what I've heard with partners in Zambia, with partners in Pakistan and others, is we need to make the right decisions for our own people, for our own communities. In the case of Malawi, we have to advance policies that support the people of Malawi, and cannot allow that the opposition rests its case on the decisions of another country when in fact we are advancing agendas that are, again, are meant to make people's lives better, that are meant to support women and people to come out of poverty, and that are grounded in respecting fundamental human rights and what is fundamental health care for all.
Thank you both for that global perspective. I now want to turn to Elizabeth for the regional perspective. So Elizabeth, even before this most recent setback, access to abortions has long been difficult or even impossible for many women. So could you elaborate on activists' strategic priorities to affect change for those most marginalized because of this decision, and how to unify these groups, specifically if you want to talk about the impact of the decisions in Kansas, the victory there, but also the recent defeat in Missouri?
Sure. So thank you. Let's set the stage a little bit, right? So right now, post Dobbs, we have 15 states that have essentially banned abortion, right? They cover largely the South and the Plains and the Midwest. You're looking at well over 20 million. We have women of reproductive age. We do not have estimates for those who are transgendered, but that's a lot of people who are living in those states without abortion access. And the clinics are closing in many of these states. So we calculated that 43 clinics have stopped providing abortion services. The news reported this morning that all 3 clinics in Louisiana, for example, will be leaving the state because they cannot provide care. So, we're looking at really this wholesale change in access, right? The number of clinics are decreasing and the distances are increasing for patients, right? The typical abortion costs about $550. So when you start adding in this idea of travel, you're talking, maybe $1,000, maybe more to travel for an abortion, as well as taking time off and trying to arrange childcare, right? So that's kind of the stage we're in. And we've been put in this place because these policies have been adopted, not only around abortion bans, but also the states that are adopting abortion bans are the states that do not have a real safety net, right? These are not the states that have been investing in pregnant people and the care for pregnancy. These are not the states that are investing in contraceptive access. These are not the states that have invested in sex education. And in fact, when these issues all come up, they get lip service or they're basically dismissed out of hand. So we're talking about a pretty difficult situation. And yet, right, we've all seen the polls. Those in the United States support abortion rights. So we're at this mismatch between policymakers and the public. And so that's why the Kansas vote was critical, because that was when people got to speak on the issue around abortion specifically. And right, there's this resounding defeat of that amendment. And, and the thing is that we're going to see more of this, right? There are going to be more amendments on the ballot, right? We already have California, Michigan, Vermont, all to protect abortion rights in their state constitutions this November. We have another Kansas-like amendment in Kentucky this November. So the idea here is it would prevent the Constitution from protecting abortion rights, right? Explicitly saying the Constitution does not protect abortion rights. We're expecting to see more of those in coming years. So we're expecting to see people having to stand for abortion rights, whether it's to defeat Kansas-like measures or to support measures around California, Michigan, Vermont type measures, right? To really, put their voices out there. But this is going to be hard. And so there is this huge network of advocates, right? Not surprising. And the network has been increasing, particularly over the past decade when we've seen so many restrictions in the states go through the legislatures. And so it's been really amazing. I mean, like if you think about the Colorado coalition right now, has about 90 organizations. Okay, I don't know how that compares internationally, but in the states, that's a lot. You think of Wyoming, you literally have one advocate Okay, right? So there's a real discrepancy in the states, but people and organizations are banding together, and they're banding together in two critical ways. One, to get care to patients. And, that is your abortion funds, your practical support groups, your lawyers helping people get through the system as well. And then it's the policy fight. We know this is a long slog. We know that we have to speak truth to power in ways that haven't been heard in some of these more conservative states. And this has to be sustained. And that's really key here. Looking at the efforts across the globe that you all have been measuring, those took a long time in many cases. And that's what we need here. Really sustained efforts. We are seeing people coming in now, really recognizing that the threat, Dobbs really kind of lit a fire in some ways. People are recognizing the threat, and now it's shifting to how do we sustain this momentum over a period of years? Because one, this didn't happen overnight, right? And two, because we know that the policymakers in some of these conservative states have been entrenched for a long time. So shifting those policies will take time and some, sort of inching toward proactive policy. But there are states that are doing these amazing things across the Northeast and the West Coast around funding of abortion. As Renee, I think, was saying, funding issues are hard. And we are seeing basically California just appropriated $200 million. We're seeing millions of dollars in New York. We're seeing millions of dollars in other states, and working to make that sustainable. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I hope that gives a flavor for what's happening in the states right now.
Yes, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And how then can individuals enact change in their local communities? Could you elaborate on some of the local initiatives going on, especially in the DMV area? For example, like the DC for CDOM movement. I
would love to. So, when we're thinking about sort of this triumvirate, right? DC, Maryland, and Virginia, I'm going to start with DC because DC is where the action is right now. Right, there are 5 bills pending with the council. A couple of them got a hearing earlier. Boy, my brain's working in July, but a couple of them didn't. And basically, they're a package, put protections around abortion and to help people pay for abortion through their health plans. DC really cannot directly fund abortion. They're limited because of Congress, essentially. Without going into much detail, it's Congress. But there are things that can be done to protect providers and patients. And the bills aren't only about abortion, they're about contraceptive care, they're about gender affirming care. So these protections, once they get through the council's on break right now, but they're coming back. And so once these bills get through the council and signed by the mayor, we'll have a real set of protections so that care can continue to be provided, because DC is a place where there isn't a gestational limit on abortion. And so it's one of the few places where clinics can set up and provide care throughout pregnancy. So we're seeing that happening, right? We have partners in abortion care setting up. We have DuPont Circle Clinic. Those are great places to advocate with. Planned Parenthood of Metropolitan Washington is a great place. Obviously, there are other organizations. I would like to note for sort of DC and United States generally, the National Abortion Federation runs the largest abortion fund in the country. And what is critical about all the abortion funds, right, is that it's not always local, right? We have patients coming from across the country, particularly to DC. So you can certainly fund the Roe Fund in Oklahoma, but also know that if you're providing the DC abortion fund money, it's going to be helping patients, not, so many patients from across the country. So Maryland, let's move to Maryland quickly. Maryland, adopted some great language this year around abortion provision and training of providers and all sorts of things. There's more to do because they couldn't even get introduced an abortion fund or supporting those who do not have documents. So we have more to do in Maryland and looking forward to seeing what is possible in January. And then in Virginia is a little bit more of a mixed bag. This is where I live, so my Commonwealth, right? And you know, there's stalwarts who have been protecting rights for a long time, but the current administration is keen on trying to adopt some restrictions. And so there's going to be more of a back and forth to hold the line, because in Virginia, a bunch of restrictions have been repealed over the past 5 years. So really access has been supported, and now we're trying to hold the line so it's not restricted, because also people are coming from other states to come to Virginia and Maryland as well. But I'm also happy to just hand over a list of organizations that are local within the area to support and connect with.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That would be great, and we can send that out after the fact. I now want to turn to open up this discussion towards the whole group. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. That's a feature under reactions, and then ask your question, but also make sure it's clear who you are addressing your question to. You can either address it internationally, regionally, or to a specific panel attendee. But let's see, are there any other notes? I'll bring in Rafi or Jill about question asking.
Thank you very much, Katie. What I'll do is just note that in the chat, we have a message from Morgan Nuzzo, and perhaps she can talk for just a moment about the work that she is doing these days.
Perfect, sounds great.
She had said she'd be available, so hopefully she can do that. She needs to be unmuted.
Hi there, my name is Morgan Nuzzo. I'm co-owner, co-founder of Partners in Abortion Care. We're the first all-trimester clinic owned by women in this country. I'm a certified nurse midwife, which also makes me unique as a clinic owner. And my partner is an OBGYN, Diane Horvath. We're expecting to open in September, pending our inspection through the state of Maryland. What Elizabeth was talking about earlier with the Abortion Access Act in Maryland was also very important to me, because as a certified midwife, I now have a full scope of practice in Maryland, which makes up Maryland a destination for abortion access, which we're very proud to be, and one of the reasons that we wanted to have our clinic there. I also previously worked for 3.5 years at the DuPont Clinic, so I am an expert in later abortion. I just wanted to say that abortion funds are so critically important, and practical support networks are so critically important, and that their funding is so important to us to get our patients to move to us from all across the country. There's only 4 clinics in the country that provide abortion past 29 weeks out of hospital, and we are going to be one of them when we open this fall. These patients are already marginalized, and they are the people who need help, and they're the people who've been moving hundreds, if not thousands of miles to seek care for decades prior to Dobbs falling. They've always been the folks who've had to move to get their abortions. They've had to leave their communities. They've had to leave their care teams that were taking care of them, often that they'd chosen for wanted pregnancies. You know, we see just the worst things that can happen to people, and then they're asked to travel thousands of miles to be with us. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a primer on later abortion, why it's so important that we maintain access. We're proud to be advocates for later abortion, and that we're here to talk and answer questions if folks have questions about that. Jill had a hard time reaching me on purpose, because we are very, very closed about the ways that you can reach us. But yeah, you can reach out to Jill if you have questions or concerns that I can answer.
Thank you so much, Morgan. And I see that Jill just dropped the website for Partners in Abortion. So let's see. Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Otherwise, we can also ask the panelists if they have questions for one another. Let's see, Christina. Oh, one sec, we'll have to make sure you unmute.
I think my question is for mainly Elizabeth. I am interested in kind of the not illegal at all, but like outside the law strategies that people are looking at. And actually, there was mention of comprehensive sex education in the Dominican Republic, but I'm wondering if there are ways to, if anyone's investigated ways to access or provide comprehensive sex education to people outside of the K through 12 system. I'm also wondering if there have been funds made available for access to long-term birth control, for example, IUDs, to prevent abortions from needing to occur in the first place. And I ask this as somebody who had to have an abortion at 16 due to my inability to get birth control. So I'm not saying like, oh, there shouldn't be abortion or anything like that. I'm just wondering if there are some sort of alternative avenues that people are investigating.
Yes, and thank you for sharing your story as well. I think, people really, so one, there are ways to access comprehensive sex education outside of the traditional K through 12 school. And in fact, that's really preferable in a lot of states. And there, Planned Parenthood has a huge educational component within its organization, and they have trained educators. There are trained educators and most, in a number of organizations, state-based organizations across the country. They're usually in the adolescent advocacy space. And that's kind of where we overlap with them around sex education and minors' consent issues. But yes, there are people who are providing, and also through churches. For example, the Unitarians and a number of other Protestant faiths have some very comprehensive sex education programs and curricula that they provide, through their churches, and they're really quite good. There's some churches that don't have as great curricula, but there are some that do. And then as far as, let's say, state funding of contraceptives, yes, actually there have been states, and I'll just point out Virginia being one of them, that have, Vermont is another, that have allocated funding specifically for long-acting methods of contraception. And they did that not necessarily because, like you were saying, you needed access to contraception, and you needed a range to pick from a range of methods. And long-acting methods tend to be the most expensive, the ones clinics can't keep in stock, those sorts of things. So the money has been going towards helping provide training, helping to ensure that that those methods remain available, more than directing somebody in a specific way, or to which method they must choose, sort of thing. It's really about sort of making sure it's as available as other methods. And then some states have been authorizing pharmacists to be able to prescribe essentially contraceptives, not IUDs, but other methods like the pill, the ring, and the patch, and in some cases injectables. So that has been going, it's been sort of a slow start. Pharmacists aren't sure how to get training. Once they get trained, it's not clear that people know that this is a possibility, but it's starting. So there are ways that states are looking to expand access to contraception, and then also other organizations around sex ed. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. And in the interest of time, maybe we can take one more quick question before leaving some time for closing comments for each of our panelists. So anyone that wants to ask a somewhat quick question, please raise your hand. Perfect. It seems like Huiling.
Hi, my name is Huiling Pan. I work on the UNA-NCA Global Goals at Home team. And this is a question for Elizabeth, piggybacking on what Christina asked earlier. I know that immediately after the release of the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court, there are a lot of advocates also sounding the alarm bell for rollback on contraceptive access. So Elizabeth, can you talk a little bit more about the risks on the horizon in terms of contraceptive access, and what efforts are being undertaken by advocates right now to protect this in the DMV area as well as nationally, and where there might be synergies to actually expand contraceptive access for that argument of averting abortions?
Sure. So thank you very much for raising that, because yes, we are anticipating that in the more conservative states that we will see rollback to access on contraception. And that will happen, we are anticipating that will happen in ways through like state budgets. There's usually a line item for family planning services that may be cut or may be restricted. A number of states already limit where this funding can go. They specifically don't want it to go to Planned Parenthood. So they've already kind of gone down that route. But what we're anticipating are also limiting access for young people, for those under 18, like requiring parental consent for contraceptives that are provided through public funding streams. Perhaps parental consent for all contraceptives. Those sorts of things are the kinds of rollbacks that we're anticipating to be kind of the first steps into limiting access to contraception, right? Because people use contraception, right? 99% of people who've needed it, who have been using contraception, right? So this is widely used. The other places we're expecting attacks on contraception are around emergency contraception access and long-acting methods, because for so long, abortion opponents have confused, intentionally misconstrued those two methods with medication abortion. So we're anticipating attacks on those two methods in particular. And then for locally, we have been fortunate, but we need to keep, let policymakers know that we are happy that they are in Maryland and DC and Virginia funding family planning services. We need to let them know that we appreciate that they are making this care available, because we don't want it to disappear, and we want them to continue to expand access to these methods. And for example, Virginia is one of those states with the pharmacist prescribing. I haven't seen a sign yet in a pharmacy about who's providing it, this service. So we have a bit of a ways to go. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And so in the interest of time, could each of our panelists please give a brief 60-second closing remarks and any way that we can reach out to you or help support your organization? So let's start with Renee.
One, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to the other panelists and Katie for moderating, and Jill for your leadership of the UNA-NCA board. Engagement on this issue is particularly important at this time. We have the confluence of the pandemic creating pragmatic barriers to access to healthcare, and it comes at the same time that we have an increase in violence of women, adolescents, and children, which has been described in a 2021 report by the UN as a shadow pandemic. Further, the Dobbs decision has created new legal uncertainty across the landscape for individuals and a range of medical providers, families, friends, and it's created ambiguity, particularly when there are conflicting health conditions as to what constitutes an unlawful abortion. If you are not already a member of UNA-NCA, please join us. If you're interested in these issues, this coffee chat was brought to you by the Advocacy Committee, the International Human Rights Committee, and the International Law Committee. And we have a fantastic CDOC committee that is chaired by Karen Mulhauser. Please join us in these activities and future programs, advocacy, and publications going forward.
Thank you so much, Renee. And yes, I second that note. Let's go to Nabeeha for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much. And it was great to be here, and I wish we had more time. So to be continued, I hope. I think, really the big takeaway is that what has happened in the US is in contrast with where the rest of the world is going. Since the 1990s, more than 60 countries have made progress. And as other colleagues here have noted, we're stepping back, we're going back. And they've made progress, and communities are fighting against not only ensuring access to abortion, but also access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services, is because when you ban an abortion, when you criminalize an abortion, it doesn't mean that abortions end. What it means is that we create more harm. And one of the leading causes for mortality and morbidity around the world in women is a result of an unsafe abortion. So there is great harm that comes from this. There's a reason why, and the United Nations agencies are very measured before they speak out to criticize any member state or any government, because governments are their constituents. Yet the United Nations experts spoke out about the harm that this decision in the US would have abroad. Also, the WHO has put out guidance on abortion protocol because of the impact of unsafe abortion on the health and well-being of communities. So what we need right now, not only PAI, but also 120 community-based organizations who are trying to mitigate the potential harm that US decisions, that harmful policies, domestically, but also potentially abroad when administrations change, are really trying to do is make sure that they've got the flexible support to drive their advocacy day in and day out. It can't be a one or done. We need the constant funding. We need to be able to amplify the evidence and the science, and we also need to bring in the human rights and the human impact perspective. And PAI, we can provide those stories, we can provide those proof points, we can provide those calls to action, and go to our website to learn more about what we do and join us as champions, both for our communities here in the US, but also abroad.
Thank you, Nabeeha. And we will be sending out a small call to action sheet after this as well. So feel free to include all of those there. And lastly, of course, but not least, Elizabeth for some closing remarks.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining. Your time is precious. So I appreciate you being here today. Yes, really, this is the time to jump in if you haven't. At Guttmacher, we produce research, we work on policy. I work with state advocates all the time and policymakers, trying to bring evidence to bear and to help move policies into a direction that support people and their health and their lives and their futures. But that's what organizations across the country are doing. So if there's a way that you can, want to contribute at the state level or the local level, I encourage you to fully jump in, because there are so many ways you can contribute, not only to Guttmacher, but to hundreds of organizations that are, doing everything from litigating to supporting patients, to making, to providing care, to training providers, and to protecting our clinics. So there's so much that we can do together.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all. Thanks to our esteemed and excellent speakers. And as Rafi has just mentioned in the chat, we will be following up with some more additional information about how you can become a member and ways to support reproductive justice. Rafi, any last things that folks should complete?
No, if you could just quickly fill out the poll, I appreciate the responses I'm seeing right now. And a recording will be sent out following this, as well as more information on how you can be an advocate for reproductive justice.
Well, thank you, and thank you all. So have a great day, and thanks.